Hi everyone, welcome back to the Communication Conflict YouTube channel, promoting mindful communication and growth through conflict. And as often the case, this is also a podcast under the name Chaos, CAOS, which can be found on Apple, Spotify, Anchor and other podcast platforms. So today what I want to talk about is the idea or the metaphor for relationships, which can be described as adult or parent-child. So as I say, it's a metaphor, it's a way of looking at relationships to try to identify reasons why sometimes those relationships don't work. And my aim really is to just simply give you a chance to reflect on difficult relationships you may be experiencing, to decide where you may be perhaps stuck in a child position or a child dynamic or a parent position or parent dynamic, and how you can move more towards an adult dynamic in that relationship. And the important thing about this is simply that it's about self-recognition. It's not about kind of blaming others, because as we'll see as we go into what I come to talk about, this is about being able to identify where we can have an influence over our experience of a relationship that doesn't become dependent on other people, which is where we often feel powerless in difficult situations. We feel dependent and powerless on them to be different to who they are. And as a consequence, we don't see the ways in which we can create changes for ourselves. But that's the thinking behind it. Unusually, I'm gonna use presentation from PowerPoint slides to kind of structure this and go through it, just to kind of explain the different kinds of modes of being that can exist. So for people listening on the podcast, I am going to read out what the content is, but if you do want to actually see it as well, then obviously feel free to check the YouTube video about it. But as I say, it's not you won't be missing any of the content, but if you do like to watch the slides as well, I'll put the link for that in the podcast information below the kind of links to the podcast. So that's what we're going to be looking at. Hope you find it interesting and useful. Please put any comments below. Please subscribe and like the video and podcast if you do find it interesting and useful. And here we go into the presentation and discussion of parent-child or adult-adult relationships. So to get started, first of all, I want to just acknowledge obviously where the idea of parent-child and adult-adult relationships come from. So Eric Berne, who was the originator of transactional analysis, which is, as I say, where this kind of idea of a metaphor originated. I can't remember when he wrote the books. I think it was kind of about back in the 70s maybe. He wrote books, two particular books, but I think he wrote others. One called Games People Play, and one called What Do You Say After You Say Hello? But obviously, having acknowledged that that's where this original metaphor came from, I just want to say that this video and podcast interprets what he said from a perspective of conflict resolution, conflict coaching and mediation practice. And so it may not exactly align with how those who are more directly transactional analysis practitioners might express the concept. So I'm kind of looking at it from the point of view of how it has an influence and a relevance to particularly conflict coaching and mediation practice under the model that I use and the people that I work with use to provide those processes. So the focus on having an adult, not parent-child relationship with clients is one of the 6 underlying philosophies of the chaos model of mediation and the model of conflict coaching that we provide and that we use to support people in resolving conflict. So it's an underpinning kind of philosophy that we're always looking to provide an adult relationship, not a parent-child relationship with the people we work with. And much of what I go on to say will hopefully clarify why that would be, but I'm not specifically talking about its relevance to mediation and conflict coaching and what we're going to look at here. This metaphor for the dynamics in relationships can have relevance to various unresolved conflict situations where the relationship is stuck in what can be described as a parent-child dynamic rather than what's more healthy, which is to be moving between parent-child and adult-adult relationships, but it's more effective when it's predominantly an adult-adult relationship. So the important benefit of this metaphor is to be able to stand back from and use it by anyone involved in order to help them improve difficult or ineffective relationships, rather than use the idea to diagnose and attribute blame. This is significantly about relationships and not individual actors, so all involved play a part in the dynamic existing, as we will see in what follows. So really want to emphasize that this isn't about saying the problem with this relationship is they're being like a child or they're being like a parent. If they're being like a child in our estimation, it also means that we're taking a parental role towards them. So we're as much part of it, much how we may not want to acknowledge that, but simply by being more clear about our own involvement as being adults, we can create the changes that we wish rather than waiting for them, the other person or the organisation, to change their approach to things. So what do I mean by a parent-child relationship? So the emphasis is on the fact we're talking about a relationship rather than individuals. Also that this is a metaphor rather than actually what happens in all relationships between parents and their children. Because many actual parent-child relationships in families are actually often quite possibly going to be more like what we describe as an adult-to-adult relationship, where autonomy in children can be supported and recognised, and children themselves can be able to make their own decisions about things. It's a kind of quick way of covering that, but what I mean is it's not literally saying all parent-child relationships are like this. It's a metaphor for where there's a dependency type relationship. So this metaphor describes a kind of dependent and sometimes codependent and almost mutually addictive dynamic that can exist in difficult and ineffective relationships. Again, noting it's a relationship, and so both or all involved play their part in it existing. But also, as I'll discuss later, any person involved has the capacity to move to an adult and less dependent role or dynamic within the relationship at any time, irrespective of whether the other person changes their dynamic or not. So example features of parent and child actions, behaviours and perspectives. So again, this isn't a definition, it's just examples to try to highlight where you might see this within yourself or within others, and to then later for us to go on and look at what can mean us being able to move to a more adult or our own adult status within that situation. So a parent might kind of come from a place, or somebody in a kind of parent dynamic might come from a place of saying a belief that if I'm the person seeing myself this way, I know what's best for others, and that children should be seen but not heard. So, they can be there, but they don't really have a valid voice because they're the children, they're the childlike actors in our relationship. They should follow my directions based on the fact that I know what's best for them. My or our way is the way it should be done. So again, they should be seen but not heard. So their voice is not one that needs to be taken into consideration. I'm the active one, I'm in charge, and I'm directing. And as a consequence of all of the above, quite often I can feel frustrated, overburdened, worn out, and even resentful. So this idea of kind of burnout will often be where people have taken a very parental stance towards many of the people they work with or live with, perhaps in their family, in their workplace, in their community. There can be this kind of sense that we're needed. We have to do all these things because perhaps nobody else is capable of it as we may see it, or nobody else is doing it as we may see it. So we've got to do it. And as I've said down the bottom, why do I have to do everything around here? It's a very common thing that people might say if they're, in a sense, taking a parental stance in a lot of relationships. My approval should be asked before you do something. If I'm taking a parental dynamic within a relationship with another person, it's as if I need to give it approval before someone can make their own decisions and actions. And then contrastingly, the child dynamic will be where I see others as responsible for my actions and what happens as a consequence of those actions. So, I only did it because they said to, even though I knew it wouldn't work and I knew that they were damaging consequences. I don't have a say in the matter because I'm the child in the relationship, so I just do as I'm told, and even if I know it's going to have a bad consequence, it's nothing to do with me because they told me to do it. They need to tell me what to do. I can't do anything without their approval or direction. It can be a kind of a feature of a childlike kind of dynamic. They're the ones at fault if things go wrong. I'm not responsible. I just did what I was told. I'm passive. I don't have any authority, so I'm just following. And as you may start to see when we're talking about authority here, we're talking about we're saying that because perhaps someone's my boss, that means that I have no choice whatsoever about what I do, even if I know it's dangerous or I know it doesn't work. So it's as if I don't believe that I have a right to express my own opinions. And as a consequence, I can feel resentful, frightened, powerless, and not listened to. So I can come to a belief that I am entirely passive and powerless and unable to express myself or do things without others kind of giving me the okay. I need their approval, but I'm also upset if I don't get it. They should know how difficult this is for me and do something to fix it. So this is kind of an example of where we have kind of what can sometimes be called the kind of mind reader situation. They should see how upset I am. They should see how difficult it is for me. I shouldn't have to tell them because they should know all about me and they should know all about everything. So this is where there's this kind of very self-disempowering kind of position comes. And with all of these things, it can be entirely understandable that we come to either of those positions. But at the same time, none of them are necessary. It's just that we may be finding it very difficult to move ourselves to more autonomous positions or less needing to feel that we've got to direct everyone and take over and do things for people, which we would do from the parent position. So a common daily example of this is this kind of interaction that might happen in a doctor's surgery very frequently. And I'm only picking this out as an example. As I say, I think, again, you could see similar examples in various different situations that exist. But a statement such as, by a doctor, "I'm going to put you on this medication." Now, it's a very common phrase. It's very seemingly fairly innocuous, but there can be risks to both what the statement implies, but also what the consequences can be. So whether it's intended or not, it fits very much a parent type statement. So it's not a discussion, it's a statement, it's a directive. The patient is deemed to be entirely accepting of that directive. So in many ways, they're in a childlike dynamic with the doctor who directs that this is what should happen. And, in many, many situations, that will be fine. People will have the medication, find that, they feel better, job done, everything's over, glad that they went to see the doctor, etc. But difficulties can arise when perhaps someone's told to take certain medication, but they have kind of concerns about, they don't really understand why, they don't feel they are aware of the possible risks and consequences, or they don't have a concern for that, but then when they take the medication, there are concerns and consequences. People might take some medication and feel, have skin rashes, some may have constipation, some may have diarrhea, some people might feel very foggy, some people might get gout. All sorts of side effects can happen from medications sometimes. And because people are the patients can be in a kind of a child mode and expect that the parent mode doctor knows everything, is always going to take control, take responsibility, make sure that they're okay, and that doesn't pan out, then obviously this is where fear comes in, because there's a dependency relationship exists between the doctor and the patient. Now, as I say, both sides are playing a part in this. The doctor is saying, I'm going to put you on this medication, as if that's how it is, there is no choice in the matter, is how it can be heard. When obviously there is a choice in the matter. A patient can say, oh, what's the medication for? What if actually that's not one I want to take? What other alternatives are? But often people will not do that, and that's their choice. But if there are negative consequences, they may then sort of feel unsafe and unhappy with the fact that the doctor has put them on the medication. So these are just examples of where, because there's a parent-child type dynamic between the doctor and the patient, difficulties can arise in the relationship. So I'm not saying they always will do, but there is a risk when it starts with a statement like, I'm going to put you on this medication, because it's very directive straight away. It's not identifying the autonomy of the patient to decide for themselves. And so if it doesn't work, there's a risk to the sense of kind of safety of that relationship. And, when things go bad in both directions, it can be that the patient feels, completely powerless and unsafe, and like they don't have anywhere to go because, the doctor was meant to fix them and they didn't, which is an unrealistic expectation, because doctors kind of just do their best to give the right medication. But it can also be from the other side, where doctors become actually very, almost more forceful and directive and unbending in their expectation of the patient to take what they give them. I've come across situations before where people have said their doctor has shouted at them for not taking the medication that they prescribed for them. And obviously when things get to that stage, it's not a healthy relationship. So before any of this suggests I'm specifically talking about healthcare related relationships, this can be true in various situations. It can be in manager-employee relationships, where there's a kind of an entire passivity expected of the employee to just simply do as they're told. Or there can be, an expectation that the manager will always get everything right, and that the second they make a mistake and get things wrong, then that obviously means they're a bad manager, and that everything's going to fall apart, and that kind of lack of safety about the environment, rather than it being, as we'll come to talk about, an adult-adult relationship. Even though there's a difference of roles, there's a recognition of fallibility on both sides, and that it can be worked on cooperatively and respectfully, and identifying that each person can be responsible for their own choices and actions in a situation. It can happen in relationships as well. Sometimes someone in a relationship may think that the other is not very good at something, or not as capable in some way, and so they have to do things for them. Just quick kind of off the cuff examples of that. Traditionally, there might have been a view that, the man looks after the accounts and the money, etc., from days where it used to be predominantly men that went out to work and the wife stayed at home, etc. And so you'd get those very parent-child kinds of dynamics over things like the accounts and the money. But then you also get similar things in relation to some partners saying that the man has to be cooked for because he can't cook for himself, or he can't dress himself, so he has to have his clothes bought for him. And these kinds of, in some relationships, that's how it pans out. That's what people agree on, whether consciously or unconsciously. But in others, it becomes more like a burden and a sense of childlikeness in the other person, or this kind of authoritarian parent kind of stance about the other person. So it feels unequal, and often there will be a blaming of the other rather than a recognition of what am I doing that maintains this situation. Because we always have the power to create change in that situation, but we will often project the cause onto the other, saying they're being like the parent or they're being like the child. Whereas the question needs to be, what can I do to be like the adult, so that those expectations of me to be in one role or another, whether that's to be parent or to be child, don't have to be maintained, and I don't have to feel a pressure to fulfill them. I can move to an adult status myself. So, just to kind of, before we go into a few more examples, just examples of what adult actions, behaviours, perspectives, etc., examples of what that can be like. So a belief that each person knows for themselves what's best for them, and there's respect for their autonomy in coming to such decisions. Each person is recognised as having a right to contribute discussions relating to their own life choices and actions, and to decide what those things shall be. So often, we might find in situations where people are vulnerable and organisations or services kind of take over what then happens in their life, and they become very disengaged, and not disengaged, kind of disenfranchised from decisions about their own life choices. So we might find this with people going into care. We might find this with young people perhaps having decisions made for them. We may find this with people at work being told they've got to do a particular thing because they're deemed to be not capable in some way. So, just as a quick example, in things like grievance procedures, sometimes people can be sent for counselling on the kind of the assessment that they're in the wrong, there's something wrong with them, so they need counselling. So it may not be a choice that the person has made for themselves, in which case that's absolutely fine. They want to draw upon that support. But when they're sent for it because they've been involved in a grievance, it's deemed that they are the ones at wrong and at fault. And traditionally, that's more likely to be an employee in a grievance procedure with a manager, that the employee is sent for counselling. Not always, but very often that will be the kind of traditional journey, and it's a very parent-child approach to the issue, and rarely effective, in my own personal opinion. Another example of adult kind of behaviour or action or perspective: each person can choose to be active or passive in relation to an issue that they're involved in. So a parental stance would be, you must always be active. I'm telling you what you've got to do. But sometimes people may just not want to do something. They may want to remain passive because from their perspective, that's what feels right for them, and that's their choice. Each person is responsible for their own choices, feelings, perspectives, and the consequences of any actions they take that follow from these choices, feelings, perspectives. So they're responsible for it. It's up to them. They are able to make those decisions for themselves. Whereas from parent-child perspectives, there will often be a non-recognition of that autonomy that people have in various situations. And a statement that someone who's in an adult position might say is, I don't have to take responsibility for everyone else. They are able, like me, to look after themselves in their own way, which includes asking for help or not. And that's very much where we might say, well, they should ask for help, or even if they don't ask for the help, they need my help, so I'm going to give it anyway. But actually the help that we're offering from a parent kind of stance may not be the help that the person's wanting, but it's where we try to take over people's situation and decide for them what's best for them. I can tell people when I'm having a difficulty or I'm concerned about something, and I take responsibility for doing so or not doing so, and the consequences of my decision. So again, we can make our own decisions about what's best for us, and someone supporting us from an adult role themselves doesn't try to tell us what we should do. They help us to take responsibility for creating our own answers. They help us think through what might work for us. And this is one of the reasons why it's an underlying philosophy of mediation and conflict coaching, where the mediator or the conflict coach isn't trying to tell people what they think they should do. They're helping them to create answers for themselves. And that's very much the focus of both processes, is that we support people in creating their own answers. We don't come in with a diagnosis or a fix as if they're not capable of doing so. So the reason that this can often be that a parent-child relationship, or the metaphor for that, can be seen as dependent, is that the parent needs the child status to exist in order to maintain its own status, and in turn the someone in a child status needs the parent status in order to maintain their own status as child, and so it effectively becomes a codependent relationship. When it's continuous and ongoing, as I think I mentioned earlier at the start, where it just kind of drops into that for a temporary reason, there's nothing dependent about it, because by definition, if it's only temporary, it's not dependent and ongoing. But often we will find difficult or ineffective relationships are where things have become continuous and codependent, and the struggle exists as a result of that. Where necessary, when either person or either side of the relationship takes an adult role within it, it intrinsically leads to a change in the other person's role and status, even if they resist it and try to maintain it, because the codependency doesn't exist anymore. So, for example, when the person who was previously in child mode is no longer looking to the other person to be in parent role towards them, as they've recognised their own capacity, their capacity for autonomy, and have started to act autonomously, thus making the role of the other person as parent superfluous, however much the other person seeks to maintain it. So once I start to take responsibility for myself, I'm not looking for the other person in parent role to do it for me. So even if they want to keep doing so, to tell me what to do, how to do it, what's best for me, even if they want to do so, once I've recognised my capacity for autonomy, it makes no difference whether they tell me to or not. I'm now making my own decisions and creating my own answers. So therefore, in many ways, the other person can continue to try to do so, but in a sense, they have to start moving towards an adult relationship towards us as well, because their parental stance can't exist anymore. And similarly, the person who was previously in parent mode no longer seeks to direct and control the other person if they move to an adult status. And if they do anything at all, they simply support the person who they previously saw as in child mode in making their own decisions, and doesn't maintain a sense of responsibility for what the other person does and seek to control that. And so the other's autonomy is more effectively recognised and respected from an adult dynamic and the perspective that that brings. So our challenge, if we feel and we recognise perhaps similarities to a difficult relationship we're involved in, is not to, in a sense, demonize the other person for being in the parent or child role or dynamic or practicing in that way. It's for us to look at how can I move to and be an adult in my relationship with this person? How can I take responsibility for my choices and actions, irrespective of whether the other person maintains their stance as parent or child or not? How can I come to a recognition that I can't control and I don't know what's best for the other person, and that if I take an adult stance, I'm not trying to run their life for them and get worn out by it and then get resentful for something that I'm the one who's actually causing, as much causing the problem in, whether I see them as aligning with it or not. What can I do to move myself to an adult place within the relationship that I'm presently finding difficult, whether I see myself in that parent role or in the child role? How can I always take my own steps to move towards being in an adult role in the situation? So just to finish off, I want to give some kind of other examples of situations where parent-child type dynamics exist, um, and can become kind of stuck in this kind of position, and therefore it not lead to an effective kind of relationship between those involved. So, and there could be hundreds of examples like this. I'm just going to kind of almost brainstorm just particular examples that I'm aware of, but if I took longer, I could come up with many more. So, for example, we have situations quite often where service providers, particularly large organisation service providers like perhaps social services departments or the NHS or local authorities, they will sometimes use outcome measures that are both decided by and measured by those who provide the service, and not by service users themselves, not in any qualitative manner particularly. And this very much reflects the kind of parental children should be seen but not heard kind of angle. So, what I'll often come across is that key performance indicators will be both decided by the organisation, but then they will assess, oh, did we do this activity? Did we do that activity? Tick, 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 yes or no. And the kind of extent to which the service user is asked about their experience is very similar as well. Did the person turn up on time? Was the person polite or something like that? So they're fairly kind of superficial but meaningless things being assessed. But if they're answered by the service user, then at least it's deemed that they're being consulted. But there's not necessarily much of a question about the quality of the experience of using the service, whether it was useful or not, whether it actually helped people to move forward or not. There'll be very superficial measures. And at the end of the day, it very much is as if the only deciders as to whether what's best was done or not are the service providers, not the service users. And obviously in a financial or a business or a customer relationship where people are buying a product, you wouldn't be able to get away with that kind of thing, because if the product didn't work, it would be taken back and you'd have to get a refund, etc. But unfortunately, with a lot of care-orientated service providers, the measurement and the decision about whether it's fulfilled is decided by them. Now, again, that can sound like a criticism of them as simply being in the parent mode, but what is often interesting to me is that people don't actually challenge that. So if they've had a bad experience, they'll still fill in the evaluation questionnaire, but they won't actually go further and take further steps to challenge the quality of what they were provided. So there are roles which people who are service users can also take in such situations, which are not just about saying that the status quo has to stay as it is. Another classic example is organisational change events or processes. which are carried out with any genuine consideration or real consideration, consultation rather, with members of the whole workforce. And it's very much on we'll tell you what's best for you. This is what's going to happen. And the fact that many people find that it's both doesn't make sense to them or it's very ineffective, and that in many areas it might make things worse rather than better, those viewpoints are not considered because we know what's best for you and we're the parents and we're going to decide. And, often this can be a reflection of the kind of the ethos or the mentality of the organization as a whole, because people are buying into this idea that those in management positions or director positions are the parents and the employees are the children, and therefore there will always be a kind of an ineffective relationship between those present, whereas an organisation which sees everybody as having equal consideration but simply different roles, there's a very different kind of dynamic will arise, and it will be much more adult to adult. But not to only focus on parent kind of angles, individuals who attribute difficulties in their present life to experiences from the past, and often the actions of others being the cause of things rather than their own. So this is taking a very child related kind of position and dynamic, because it's saying that I am not responsible for what I do now, even if in the past it might have been difficult for me to do so. I'm still not, even though I'm very much clearly an adult, an autonomous adult. I have the capacity to create changes in my life, but instead it's saying I'm still doing this because of what happened to me in the past. And again, it's always understandable that people can be in these positions and mindsets, but the point I'm making is it doesn't work. So, as I say, I'm not trying to make this out as being a criticism of any of us who take these positions. I'm just pointing out that to do so doesn't work, and we're all fallible and all potentially going to do it. But this metaphor is an option for looking at how we're behaving in certain situations, both as organisations and as individuals, and to think, well, how might I be able to create change for myself in this situation? And another one, an organisational level, where I see some organisations, particularly charities, that will adopt a kind of a childlike status in response to people who fund them, is they'll say, oh, we've got to do this thing even though we don't think it works. We don't think it works for our service users, but the funders are saying we've got to do it. And it's like, well, funders want their money to be used effectively. So if that kind of thing isn't challenged, it means the funders aren't having the funding they're giving used effectively, and they're not learning and developing and growing. And at the same time, the organisation isn't providing what it could be providing, because it's not actually focusing on the things that it knows to be the best. It's saying you can't challenge it because it's the funders who pay our money. Well, that kind of doesn't make sense. But often it is that people in certain positions don't feel able to challenge. So it can be more about supporting those people to look at how could you challenge this, given that you see that this isn't working effectively. But to say you can't challenge the funders nowadays, of course you can. You can always challenge anybody. But to not do so is adopting a passive and childlike status. And again, it can be understandable that people might feel intimidated to do so. But it doesn't mean to say you can't do so. It just means that person might need support and an opportunity to look at how they're dealing with things and what they might feel would help them in being able to challenge more effectively. So these are just ending examples. As I say, I could go on for probably 2 hours with other examples, but the video is proving quite long anyway. So I just want to leave it there, that this is looking at the metaphor for parent-child and the metaphor for adult-to-adult relationships, and how they can, by looking at relationships in this way, we can often start to identify the opportunities that we have to create change for ourselves, rather than see it as a dependent relationship with another organization or another individual. and therefore feel stuck because we feel dependent on them. But when we take an adult stance, we're able to fulfill that. We're no longer dependent on them, and therefore we can kind of bring us out of these kinds of codependency, frightening, anxious, frustrating, resentful situations that we can find ourselves in when we see ourselves as powerless, or either over others in the parent role, or powerless to challenge others in the child role. So there we have it. That's where I'll leave it. If you have any views on this, please put them in the comments below. If you've got questions, put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, to see whether you recognize any of this in your own actions, and how you've been able to create change for yourself. But as always, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you did enjoy the video and find it useful. Have a good day, and hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.